Buongiorno ragazzi and welcome to a new Italian 101 video. Today we're going to study a special category of verbs, modal verbs. We know already by heart, I hope, that verbs are those words that we use to talk about actions, like to play, to study, to read, to rest, to sit, to draw, to wait, right? I hope we also remember that those forms that I just listed, those examples in red and the others that I mentioned are called infinitives, right? Those are the forms of the verb that um, refer to the action in general without anybody actually doing the action. To play is just the action of playing in general. To study, the action of studying in general, and so on. We're not referring to anybody actually playing or studying, right? So with that in mind, today we're going to study a special kind of verb that is called the modal verb. Those are verbs that are combined with other verbs and other expressions in sentences, but mostly other verbs. And they're used to express things like desire to do a thing, or need to do a thing, or ability to do a thing. Okay? Let us look first at some examples in English. Three specific examples are used a lot. To have to be able to, and to want. For example, I want to study. If you look at this simple sentence carefully, you will see that we have two verbs here, right? We have to want and to study. And by combining the two of them, I am expressing my desire to study. Right? Another very simple example, he is able to eat. Same case as before, we have two verbs here, to be able to and to eat, right? And by combining them in this fashion, I am able to say that I'm able to eat, right? Last example, with to have to, we have to work, right? Again, to have to is one verb, to work is another, but I combine them in order to express my duty to work. Now, you probably have noticed that I am dividing these sentences in three parts, and I have colored them with three different colors. Let me show you what those colors are. The first color, the green with which they start, is of course the subject. I hope you remember that the subject is whoever or whatever is doing the action, right? And now in red and in blue, I have marked the two verbs that I'm using in each of the sentences. The verb in red is the modal verb. And then the verb in blue is the second verb that the modal verb is modifying. For example, in the sentence I want to study, to want is a modal verb, and it modifies the verb to study in order to express my desire to study. In the sentence, he is able to eat, the modal verb is to be able to, and it modifies the verb to eat in order to express that he has the ability to eat. And in the last one, the verb to have to is combined with to work in order to express our duty to work. Okay? So these modal verbs in red, to have to be able to, and to want, can be combined with other verbs in order to express duty in case of to have to, ability in case of to be able to, and desire in the case of to want. Lastly, let's look at these three sentences again. Let's look at the part in blue. To study, to eat, and to work. If you recall, in English, that form of the verb that is preceded by to is called the infinitive. Okay? So, in these sentences, even though I am using two verbs, I'm conjugating only one, right? I am conjugating the modal verb. The other remains in the infinitive. Okay? Let's look at the same three verbs, but in Italian, because they're also modal in Italian. The verbs are dovere, which means to have to, potere, which means to be able to, and volere, which means to want. They're called modal because they work just like their counterparts in English. They modify other actions, and they tell us that they're necessary in the case of dovere, that they're possible in the case of potere, or that they're desired in the case of volere. And the cool thing here is that the structure is just the same as the one we saw in English. First, we start with the subject, whoever is doing the action. Then we conjugate the modal verb according to that subject, and we end with the infinitive. For example, io voglio cantare means I want to sing. Look at the colors in the sentences and the order of those colors, and you'll see that the structure is the same, right? I start with the subject, whoever's doing the action. In this case, it is I, right? So io in Italian, I in English. Then I use the conjugated form of the verb, want in English, and then voglio, which is the io form of volere. Io voglio, I want. And then the last verb is in the infinitive. To sing in English, using the to. Cantare in Italian, using that are ending, which is the infinitive, right? So subject, followed by the conjugated modal verb, followed by the infinitive. Same thing here. Lei deve studiare. We start with the subject lei, she. We follow with the verb dovere, conjugated for lei, that is deve. And then the last verb, studiare, in the infinitive. Noi possiamo finire, a final example. We can finish, or we are able to finish. Same thing. We start with the subject, noi. We have potere conjugated for noi, which is possiamo, and then finire is the infinitive. Okay? So this is the structure we use in both English and Italian. We start with the subject, we follow with the modal verb, which is conjugated, and then we end with the infinitive of the second verb. Okay? Now you might have noticed that these three conjugations, voglio, deve, and possiamo, are not following the rules for regular verbs that we have studied, right? Well, that is because these three verbs are irregular. These are the last three irregular verbs we're going to learn. Here you have the three conjugation tables of these three verbs. For now, do not worry about memorizing these. For now. For now, we're going to work only with the structure. But do keep in mind that these three verbs do not follow the rule, okay? They are just like essere and avere. They are irregular. So the conjugation for dovere is io devo, I have to. Tu devi, you have to. Lui deve, lei deve, he has to and she has to. Noi dobbiamo, we have to. Voi dovete, you guys have to. And loro devono, they have to. Right? Notice that it's to have to, not just to have, right? Dovere expresses the necessity to do something, right? To must is another possible translation. For potere, to be able to or to can, right? The conjugation is io posso, I can, or I'm able to. Notice the double S, posso. Then tu puoi, pronounce your vowels clearly. Puoi, tu puoi, you can. Lui può, he can. Lei può, she can, or she's able to, right? Noi possiamo, we are able to. Voi potete, you guys are able to. And loro possono, they are able to. And lastly, for volere, probably the most important of these, because it's important to be able to say what you want, right? Io voglio, I want. Notice that it has the gli sound. Tu vuoi, you want. Lui vuole, he wants. Lei vuole, she wants. Noi vogliamo, we want. Voi volete, you guys want. And loro vogliono, they want. Okay? So again, these three verbs are irregular. They do not follow the conjugation pattern. And the way you use them to express necessity to do something, or possibility to do something, or desire to do something is using the structure you have in the middle of this slide. You start with the subject, then you conjugate the modal verb, and then you combine it with the infinitive of the second verb. Let's look at some examples. As I said, you don't really have to worry about memorizing the conjugation just now, so I'm just going to give you the table. I'm also going to give you the structure that we are supposed to use. Start with the subject, then conjugate the modal verb, and then add the infinitive of the second verb. And knowing these two things, I'm going to ask you to think about this. How do you say in Italian, I want to sing? I want to sing. Well, first you start with the subject, right? Come si dice I? How do you say I? Io, right? So that's our first word, io. And then want. You want to pick out of these three verbs the one that means to want. So it's volere, right? But you have to use the io form of volere. So look at the table and find the io form of volere. It's the first one, right? Because we always start with io. So it's io voglio. Good. Very good so far. Io voglio. And then to sing. We have to find the infinitive of to sing. We know that one, I hope. It's from the most common adjective verbs that we have been using a lot. How do you say to sing? Cantare. So let's combine those three things. Io voglio cantare, right? The green is the subject, the red is the conjugated modal verb, and the blue is the infinitive of the second verb. Io voglio cantare. Okay? A second example. Again, here we have our table, here we have our structure. And I want to say they are able to eat. So what do we start with? We start with they. How do you say they? In Italian, you say loro, right? Then you look for the loro form of the verb potere, the one in the middle of the table, right? Because that's the one that means to be able. The loro form is always the last one we have, so it's possono. Loro possono. And lastly, to conclude our sentence, how do you say to eat? You say mangiare, right? So loro possono mangiare. They are able to eat. Let's do one last example here, following that structure, right? Subject, followed by conjugated verb, conjugated modal verb, sorry, and concluded with the infinitive of the second verb. Here's our table, here's our structure, and I want to say something that is actually very true. I want to say you guys have to study. Okay? Yeah, sorry, silly joke, but it is true that you guys have to study. So how do you say you guys? I hope you remember that you guys is voi, right? So it's the second to last row, voi. Now we want the verb that means to have to, which is dovere, right? which is the voi form of dovere. You can see in your table that it's dovete. Right? So we say voi dovete. And to conclude our sentence, how do you say to study? I hope that when you do remember, studiare, right? Studiare. So combining the three things, voi dovete studiare. You guys have to study. Okay? So summing up, modal verbs are verbs that you combine with other verbs to express certain things about that second action, right? In the case of these three, that someone has to do that action, or that someone is able to do it, or that someone wants to do it. They're called modal verbs because they modify other verbs or other complements for the sentence, right? And the way you use them is you start with your subject as always, then you conjugate the modal verb, and then you add your second verb, but in the infinitive. Ok? Grazie ragazzi, a dopo.